Raymond Lully, who was one of the great early alchemists, once pointed out that the great tragedy of the concept of alchemy was the transmutation of metals. Basil Valentine, monk of St. Bennet, had the same thought when he wrote into one of his books, "Woe to the gold makers." Now, this is an interesting thought because our subject this morning essentially is esoteric alchemy. And the history of alchemy itself divides into two distinct branches that have descended from antiquity, possibly originating in Egypt. The word chem in both chemistry and alchemy is an ancient name for Egypt. El is divine or sacred, and we find it used in the Bible in such terms as Elohim, and of course the deity of Islam is Allah. The divine prefix would indicate that alchemy is a spiritual art, a divine secret science. The great texts of alchemy have come principally from the Hermetic background at the beginning of the Christian era. And probably there were alchemical schools in Alexandria at that time. Also, we have early records of alchemy in China and in India. And it seems that from a very far back, there has descended a double concept of chemistry. Physical chemistry having to do with those areas of knowledge which are now considered scientific, and spiritual chemistry, which was definitely a sacred art. In practice, what is the difference in these two systems? I think probably Paracelsus summarized this rather well when he pointed out that the alchemical transmutation was impossible unless the alchemist himself was in the process of transformation. He could not sit back with his bottles and test tubes and retorts and consider his art simply another way of advancing chemistry or a way of replenishing his own financial needs. So we find, as is today, that chemistry is largely dominated with the profit concept, the idea of wealth. We are making all kinds of chemical experiments for various reasons, some of them very good, some of them very dangerous, but always with a certain concept of return in material wealth for the good or the evil that is done. So that largely chemistry is a material art dominated by scientific inquiry and not in any way involving any necessary spiritual overtones. The chemist does not have to be a person of great faith. He does not have to have had a metaphysical experience. He does not need to believe in metaphysical or mystical procedures. He is simply working with physical tests and physical texts. The alchemist, on the other hand, is an entirely different type of person. In the history of alchemy, as it is descending to us, most of the alchemists were very pious people, deeply religious, and convinced that their advancement of science was a spiritual contribution to the well-being of society. The alchemist was concerned with the advancement of his own inner life. Jacob Boehme used a number of alchemical terms in his mystical writings, and these have been very confusing to modern students of his work. But actually, the use given by Boehme in most cases is probably the original intended usage, namely that it is all part of a great system of human regeneration, that it has nothing to do whatsoever with the advancement of worldly goods or worldly position. Now, in Europe, the alchemists got into trouble, very serious trouble. and were persecuted and in many cases put to the rack and tortured to death. Why? Because the rulers or avaricious leaders wanted the secret of gold making. So the moment the alchemist himself began to publicize this part of his belief, he immediately opened himself to persecution. So that the gold making as a science brought many of the alchemists to destruction. Also, the manufacture of gold or any other precious substance without control by the state could result in the bankruptcy of the world. So the ancients were very careful on that point. Now the question then remains is, can gold be actually manufactured? Not whether it should be or not, but can it be? I think the answer has to be in the affirmative. It can be. It also is obvious from recent experimentation that the subject could be advanced, and in the course of time it is probable that artificial metals can be created by chemistry and by the various forms of progress that we now have in the sciences. But this is not the real purpose of alchemy. And where the chemists all get together to raise their own level of economic living, the science went into a very desperate prostitution. It was not for that purpose at all. The earliest alchemists that we know were using symbols at a very early date. Many cases, the symbols have been accepted as literal pictures, and this has led to further confusion. We know, for instance, that in ancient alchemy, the great retort in which all the experiments were being made was the solar system itself, viewed as a globe, within which all the chemistries and alchemies of existence were taking place. We know from our own researches in more recent times, and the ancients certainly believed, that this world in which we live is a great theater of mysteries, the major secrets of which have never been solved. That actually the world is a strangely complete thing, within itself containing everything necessary for the infinite perpetuation of itself. And this condition goes on rather peacefully and naturally until human ambition and avarice take over. The ambition of the average modern person is involving fame, distinction, or wealth. Therefore, he immediately is using knowledge for the formation, directly or indirectly, of gold.